The man who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, with fierce compassion for society's outcasts, became the very oppressor he condemned in his fiction. Behind the Nobel Prize winner who championed America's forgotten souls lay a man whose private cruelties would have destroyed the very people he claimed to defend in his novels. Picture this defining moment. A pregnant woman, kicked down a flight of stairs by her husband, the same man whose pen had created some of literature's most compassionate portraits of human suffering. He wished their premature son would die because the infant was taking up too much of his wife's time. The only tears he ever shed, she would later recall, were for his pet rat. Here was a writer who could imagine the inner lives of migrant workers with stunning empathy, yet remained utterly blind to the anguish he inflicted on his own family. He crafted characters of profound moral courage, while displaying a cowardice that manifested as systematic emotional terrorism against those who loved him most. How does a man who championed the downtrodden become a domestic oppressor? The answer lies buried in a psychology so complex that it took decades for the full truth to emerge. Recent interviews and previously sealed documents reveal not just the tortured artist struggling with his demons, but something far more disturbing. A man whose capacity for literary greatness coexisted with an almost pathological inability to extend that same humanity to his wives and children. This is the story of how genius and monstrosity can inhabit the same soul, and the terrible price paid by those caught in the shadow of American literature's most celebrated champion of the downtrodden. John Ernst Steinbeck Jr. was born on February 27, 1902, in Salinas, California, into a household that would shape every contradiction of his adult character. The Victorian mansion on Central Avenue housed a family where emotional distance masqueraded as respectability, where love was conditional upon performance, and where a sensitive boy learned early that feelings were dangerous things to express. His father, John Ernst Steinbeck Sr., served as treasurer of Monterey County, but carried himself with the resigned dignity of someone who had long ago abandoned his dreams. Years later, on his deathbed, he would confess that he felt his entire life had been unfulfilled. This admission would echo through Steinbeck's fiction like a recurring nightmare, the specter of wasted potential haunting character after character. But it was his mother, Olive Hamilton Steinbeck, who proved the more formative influence. A former schoolteacher, with literary pretensions, she wielded perfectionism like a weapon. Nothing her children did was ever quite good enough for Olive's exacting standards. She parceled out approval like a miser dispensing coins, always making it clear that love was something to be earned through achievement, never freely given. The Steinbeck household maintained all the external markers of middle-class success. They employed maids and servants, lived in one of Salinas's finer homes, and moved in respectable social circles. Yet beneath this veneer of Victorian propriety lay an emotional wasteland. Conversations remained surface level, feelings went unexpressed, and intimacy was treated as a form of weakness. Young John learned to navigate this landscape by developing what would become his lifelong pattern, a public face of charm and sensitivity, masking a private capacity for stunning callousness. At school, he excelled in English composition while failing at nearly everything else. Teachers described him as intelligent but difficult, a child who seemed to deliberately court disapproval. His escape came in the form of long, solitary walks across the Salinas Valley. While other children played together or participated in the town's weekly dances, John wandered alone through fields and forests. These walks reinforced his growing sense of himself as fundamentally different from and superior to his peers. The summers brought different education entirely. Despite the family's comfortable circumstances, John worked on local ranches and at the Spreckles sugar beet factory. Here he first encountered the harsh realities faced by California's agricultural workers, experiences that would later fuel his greatest novels. He witnessed firsthand how poverty stripped away choices, how the powerful exploited the desperate, and how society's forgotten souls bore their suffering with dignity that shamed their oppressors. Yet even these formative experiences reveal the contradiction at Steinbeck's core. While he genuinely empathized with the workers' plight and would later channel that empathy into powerful fiction, he never grasped the irony of his position as the boss's son, who could return each evening to comfort while they remained trapped. This distance would characterize his entire approach to the downtrodden. Deep literary sympathy, combined with an inability to truly understand what it meant to have no escape route. The first major crisis came in 1918 when he was 16. The influenza pandemic struck Salinas with devastating force. John contracted both flu and pneumonia, a combination that carried a death sentence for many victims. With hospitals overwhelmed, the family physician operated in the Steinbeck dining room, cutting through one of John's ribs to drain fluid from his collapsed lung. The makeshift operating theater, with its blood-stained linens and desperate family members, became John's first intimate encounter with mortality. For days, the teenager hovered between life and death. The experience left profound psychological scars that would influence both his writing and behavior for the rest of his life. The near-death experience reinforced his growing sense of being special, chosen, different from ordinary people. While his peers worried about schoolwork and social acceptance, he had wrestled with death itself and emerged victorious. This brush with mortality became a source of both creative inspiration and personal arrogance, feeding his belief that normal rules didn't apply to him. As he recovered, patterns that would define his adult relationships began to emerge. He became increasingly demanding of his mother's attention, testing her love through increasingly difficult behavior. When she failed to meet his impossible standards, he retreated into sullen resentment. This cycle of testing, disappointment, and withdrawal would later characterize every intimate relationship of his life. His father's quiet desperation also left its mark. John watched the older man move through his days like a sleepwalker, fulfilling duties without passion or hope. The sight terrified the young man, who vowed never to allow himself to be trapped in such a living death. Yet this fear of mediocrity would later drive him to extremes of behavior that were themselves a form of imprisonment. By graduation from Salinas High School, the essential contradictions of Steinbeck's character were in place. He possessed genuine empathy for society's victims, yet showed stunning cruelty toward those closest to him. He craved approval, while simultaneously sabotaging relationships that might provide it. He understood suffering intellectually while remaining emotionally detached from the pain he inflicted on others. The boy who would write some of America's most compassionate fiction was already learning to compartmentalize his capacity for empathy, saving it for strangers and literary characters, while denying it to the real people who shared his daily life. This psychological split would fuel his greatest artistic achievements while destroying nearly every personal relationship he would ever attempt to build. Stanford University in 1920 should have been John Steinbeck's gateway to intellectual fulfillment. Instead, it became a laboratory where he perfected the art of self-sabotage and refined the psychological patterns that would later destroy his marriages and alienate his children. He arrived on campus carrying the emotional baggage of his Salinas upbringing, but Stanford would add new layers of dysfunction to his developing personality. The young man who enrolled as an English major possessed genuine literary talent and burning ambition, yet he systematically undermined every opportunity the university offered. His academic record reads like a case study in deliberate failure. He enrolled in classes that might help his writing, then attended sporadically or not at all. He joined the officer training corps with apparent enthusiasm, only to drop out after a few weeks. He tried out for the football team, displaying natural athletic ability, then abandoned the sport as soon as coaches began making demands. This wasn't youthful experimentation, but the establishment of a pattern. The inability to sustain commitment when it demanded genuine intimacy or accountability to others. His professors quickly identified him as a student with exceptional potential who seemed determined to waste it. He possessed a natural gift for language and intuitive understanding of human psychology, but he refused to submit to the discipline required to develop these talents properly. When assignments challenged his preconceptions, he became sullen and resentful, interpreting constructive criticism as personal attack. His relationship with alcohol deepened into something troubling during these years. Drinking became his primary social activity and preferred method of emotional regulation. When classes frustrated him, he drank. When relationships became complicated, he drank more. The pattern reinforced his growing mythology of himself as a tortured artist whose genius was too profound for ordinary people to understand. During this period, he met Kate Beswick, a fellow student who became the first victim of his lifelong pattern of psychological abuse, disguised as romantic passion. Kate was intelligent, supportive, and genuinely interested in his writing qualities that should have made her ideal for a budding author. Instead, they made her the perfect target for his emerging capacity for emotional manipulation. The letters he wrote to Kate reveal a disturbing glimpse into his developing pathology. While she typed his manuscripts and offered encouragement, he responded with correspondence that was crude, demanding, and shockingly insensitive. According to surviving letters, he boasted about indulging in what he called his two favorite sins, and expressed hope that he had enough sperm left to someday start a family with her. These weren't clumsy attempts at humor, but calculated exercises in dominance, designed to test how much degradation she would accept. Each letter pushed boundaries further, measuring her tolerance while positioning himself as the prize she should be grateful to pursue. The dynamic they established would become the template for every intimate relationship in Steinbeck's life. His living arrangements reflected the same self-sabotage. Despite his family's financial resources, he chose increasingly squalid conditions, eventually residing in what amounted to a shed. This wasn't noble poverty, but deliberate degradation designed to support his emerging mythology as a suffering artist whose genius was unappreciated by a materialistic world. The shed became the setting for his most disturbing behavior during these years. Fellow students reported hearing him fire a pistol into the walls during fits of anger or depression, regular occurrences that terrified neighbors and demonstrated complete disregard for others' safety. The pistol shooting incidents reveal crucial aspects of his developing personality: his tendency toward violence as response to frustration, his need to control through fear and intimidation, and his belief that his emotional needs justified any behavior, regardless of how it affected others. When confronted about the danger he posed, he responded not with apology, but with resentment toward those who dared question his actions. By the time he left Stanford, without graduating in spring 1925, Steinbeck had established every psychological pattern that would govern his adult life. Most crucially, he had developed an unshakable belief in his own specialness that would protect him from genuine self-reflection for the rest of his life. His New York adventure should have been his literary breakthrough, the moment when his undeniable talent finally received the recognition it deserved in the nation's cultural capital. Instead, it became a brutal education in the consequences of his own character flaws, a descent into psychological darkness that would leave permanent scars on his psyche and provide him with a lifetime supply of self-pity and excuses for future failures. The journey itself foreshadowed the disaster to come with almost prophetic clarity. Steinbeck had carefully saved enough money for passage through the Panama Canal to New York, demonstrating that he was capable of long-term planning and delayed gratification when it served his ultimate goals. But his inability to control his impulses immediately sabotaged these plans in a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. During a port stop along the way, he encountered a woman who caught his attention, and with the reckless disregard for consequences that would characterize his entire adult life, he spent his carefully hoarded travel funds pursuing her in what can only be described as a fit of sexual and romantic obsession. The brief liaison ended predictably in disappointment and mutual recrimination, leaving him arriving in Manhattan nearly penniless, having squandered his financial security for a momentary gratification that provided no lasting satisfaction. This pattern of destroying long-term goals for short-term pleasure would manifest repeatedly in his personal relationships, where he would systematically undermine partnerships that provided him with emotional support and practical assistance in exchange for temporary excitements that ultimately left him more isolated and bitter than before. Desperate for work, he found employment at Madison Square Garden construction site, pushing wheelbarrows filled with cement. 3 weeks in, a coworker fell to his death, landing directly in front of the young writer in a spray of blood and broken bones. The immediate physical reality of sudden death struck Steinbeck with devastating force. In the 1920s, workplace deaths were far more common than in later decades, and society expected workers to simply absorb such traumas and continue with their lives. For Steinbeck, however, the incident became something more than a workplace accident. It merged with his existing anxieties about mortality and meaning, reinforcing his sense that life was fundamentally arbitrary and cruel. More importantly, it provided him with new source of self-pity and justification for future failures. Through family connections, he secured a reporter position with the New York American, but his inability to accept authority led to predictable conflict. His approach to journalism reflected the same patterns that had characterized his academic career, capable of brilliant individual pieces when the subject engaged his interest, but incapable of the consistent, reliable work that professional journalism required. His living arrangements revealed his continued commitment to the romantic mythology of the suffering artist. Despite his family's financial resources, he chose to live in a $1-a-night hotel in one of the city's seedier neighborhoods. This wasn't economic necessity but psychological theater, reinforcing his self-image as a misunderstood genius. The hotel became the setting for another romantic disaster. He pursued a chorus girl with obsessive intensity, showering her with attention and gifts he could barely afford, including his signet ring as a token of devotion. The relationship ended predictably when she chose a wealthy banker over an unstable wannabe writer, marrying him 2 days after accepting Steinbeck's ring. The rejection struck at the core of his narcissistic self-image, forcing him to confront the possibility that his charm and talent might not be enough to secure the devotion he believed he deserved. Within days of this romantic catastrophe, he also lost his newspaper job. What happened next represents one of the most mysterious periods in Steinbeck's early life. According to his own later accounts, he spent several days in Bellevue Hospital, the city's psychiatric facility. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but this incident suggests his psychological state had deteriorated to a degree requiring professional intervention. What seems most likely is that Steinbeck experienced a crisis of the grandiose self-image that had sustained him through his Stanford years and early months in New York. The city had confronted him with undeniable evidence that his talent, charm, and sense of specialness were not sufficient to guarantee success or love. The summer following Bellevue was perhaps the lowest point of his early adult life. He remained in New York despite having no job, no prospects, and dwindling resources. Most crucially, he found himself unable to write the one activity that had always provided both purpose and escape. This creative paralysis represented something more serious than writer's block. It was the complete breakdown of his primary coping mechanism. When he finally accepted that his New York experiment had failed completely, Steinbeck worked his passage on a ship heading back to San Francisco, completing a journey that brought him geographically full circle, but psychologically to a much darker and more dangerous place than where he had started. The New York period had accomplished something that all his previous failures had not. It had provided him with genuine trauma and suffering that he could use to justify his future behavior, while teaching him that his psychological survival depended on never again placing himself in situations where his fundamental worth might be genuinely tested by objective standards or unsympathetic observers. Most importantly, the experience had taught him that he could use his literary talent not just as a means of artistic expression, but as a form of psychological warfare, a way of controlling how others perceived him and his actions. The stories he would later tell about his New York struggles would be carefully crafted to generate sympathy and admiration for his perseverance in the face of adversity, while conveniently omitting the self-destructive choices and character flaws that had actually caused his downfall. This lesson in narrative control would prove invaluable throughout his later career as he learned to shape public perception of his personal relationships and behavior through selective storytelling and strategic omission of inconvenient facts. The mythology he began constructing around his New York failure would serve as a template for all his future reputation management efforts, establishing patterns of deception and manipulation that would protect him from accountability for decades to come. The young man who returned to California carried with him not wisdom gained through hard experience or humility, earned through genuine suffering, but a collection of grievances against a world that had failed to recognize his worth and a determination to ensure that he would never again be subjected to such harsh and objective judgment of his character and abilities. Returning to California, Steinbeck found refuge at Lake Tahoe as caretaker of a grand estate. The isolation became a laboratory for developing the persona that would define his life. During this period, he resumed correspondence with Kate Beswick, using their renewed contact to refine his techniques of emotional manipulation. When spring arrived, he moved to a trout hatchery in Tahoe City, where he encountered Carol Henning and her sister during a holiday visit. His opening gambit was typical. He made them laugh by describing himself as a trout midwife, using self-deprecating humor to assess their potential value. When the sisters departed, Steinbeck's true nature revealed itself. Rather than accepting their departure naturally, he fell into depression characterized by increased drinking and unpredictable behavior. The incident that followed provided a chilling preview of future violence. When another young woman rebuffed his advances, he physically grabbed her, dragged her upstairs, and dangled her by her ankles from an upper-story window while she screamed in terror. This wasn't momentary loss of control, but calculated dominance designed to punish her for failing to submit to his desires. The window dangling episode reveals his fundamental view that other people existed to serve his needs and deserved punishment when they failed to do so. Shortly after this display of violence, Steinbeck was fired from the hatchery for wrecking the facility's new truck. Undaunted, he pursued Carol to San Francisco, finding warehouse work to sustain his romantic campaign. When his father offered the family cottage in Pacific Grove, with a monthly allowance disguised as a loan, Steinbeck accepted with characteristic entitlement. The cottage years established the pattern that would define his life: creative productivity, built on systematic exploitation of women who believed they were partners in a noble artistic enterprise. Carol became not simply a supportive partner, but an unpaid employee whose labor was essential to his productivity and whose emotional needs were systematically subordinated to his artistic ambitions. The myth of their partnership that would later be promoted by Steinbeck and his biographers painted a romantic picture of two young people choosing love over material comfort, building a life together through shared sacrifice and mutual support. Literary historians would later describe their early years as an inspiring example of how true love could overcome economic hardship and social disapproval. The reality was far more disturbing. A narcissistic man who had learned to identify and exploit women willing to sacrifice themselves for what they believed was a worthy cause, and a young woman who had not yet learned to recognize the warning signs of an abusive relationship disguised as artistic partnership. Carol's contributions to Steinbeck's early work went far beyond the typing and clerical support that is typically acknowledged in biographical accounts. She served as his first reader and editor, offering suggestions that improved his prose style and helped him develop his distinctive narrative voice. She managed their correspondence with publishers and agents, freeing him to focus entirely on the creative aspects of his work. More significantly, she provided the emotional regulation that allowed him to maintain the psychological equilibrium necessary for sustained creative work. When he fell into the depressions that regularly accompanied his writing process, she provided encouragement and support. When he became manic with excitement over a new project, she helped him channel that energy productively. She learned to anticipate his moods and manage their household routine around his creative needs. This emotional labor was perhaps the most valuable service she provided, though it would never be acknowledged or compensated. The stability and support she offered allowed him to take the creative risks that would eventually establish his literary reputation, but he would later minimize or deny her contributions entirely. The year 1934 marked Steinbeck's emergence as a major American writer. But this literary breakthrough reveals a pattern of exploitation that makes his public success deeply troubling. The deaths of his parents within months of each other should have prompted grief and reflection. But Steinbeck's response revealed emotional coldness his public persona had successfully hidden. When his mother died in February, after her paralyzing stroke, his reaction was relief rather than sorrow. His father's death 3 months later, despite the older man's deathbed confession of feeling unfulfilled, was processed not as a call to compassion, but as raw material for fiction. Steinbeck transformed paternal anguish into literary capital, while showing no genuine empathy. 5 days after his father's funeral, Tortilla Flat was published to immediate success. The novel's triumph provided financial security and established him as a significant literary voice. But the real story reveals troubling dynamics. While Steinbeck received all credit and rewards, the book wouldn't have existed without Carroll's invisible labor, typing countless drafts, correcting errors, making editorial suggestions, and providing emotional support. More significantly, Carroll had provided much of the financial support that made writing possible. While Steinbeck cultivated his image as a struggling artist, Carroll's employment had helped sustain their household. The dynamic established Carroll as not just a wife, but an unpaid employee essential to his productivity. His friendship with marine biologist Ed Ricketts deepened during this period, providing intellectual stimulation but also serving a more troubling function. Time spent in Ricketts's laboratory became escape from Carroll and marriage's emotional demands. Rather than developing deeper connection with his wife, he increasingly turned to Ricketts for meaningful conversation that should have been part of his marriage. The success of Tortilla Flat revealed another disturbing aspect: Steinbeck's inability to express genuine gratitude to those who made his success possible. He seemed to view Carroll's assistance and his father's support as his due payment owed because of his special gifts. When commissioned to write about migrant workers for what would become The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck's approach was characterized by the same emotional detachment marking his personal relationships. While genuinely moved by workers' suffering, his primary interest was transforming their experiences into literary material. He observed as someone who could return each night to comfort, not as someone who truly understood desperation without escape. The pattern of using Carroll's support while giving increasingly little in return accelerated during The Grapes of Wrath's composition. She continued typing drafts, managing household duties, and providing encouragement while receiving less time, attention, and affection in return. The novel's 1939 publication transformed Steinbeck into a national sensation. It sold 500,000 copies in its first year and won the Pulitzer Prize. But while the public celebrated him as champion of the downtrodden, his private behavior toward Carroll had become monstrous. The most horrifying example emerged during what should have been supreme joy: Carroll's pregnancy. Rather than celebrating impending fatherhood, Steinbeck became immediately resentful of attention and resources a child would require. His reaction was swift and brutal. He insisted Carroll undergo an abortion despite her desperate desire for motherhood. The psychology behind this demand reveals the depth of his narcissistic pathology and his complete inability to tolerate any challenge to his position as the absolute center of attention in their relationship. To Steinbeck, Carol's pregnancy represented not the creation of new life or the natural evolution of their partnership, but a fundamental threat to the dynamics that allowed him to maintain total control over their household and her emotional energy. His campaign to force her compliance with his demand for abortion was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined emotional blackmail, gaslighting, and systematic undermining of her confidence in her own desires and judgment. He began by presenting the pregnancy as a betrayal of their shared commitment to his artistic mission, arguing that she had selfishly chosen to get pregnant at a time when his career was finally beginning to flourish. When she protested that the pregnancy was unplanned and that she had always assumed they would eventually have children, he reframed her natural maternal instincts as evidence of her failure to understand the sacrifices that true artistic achievement required. He convinced her that wanting a child was a sign of bourgeois conformity and lack of commitment to the higher calling they had supposedly embraced together. This wasn't mutual decision-making, arrived at through careful consideration of their circumstances, but unilateral demand backed by emotional terrorism, designed to break down her resistance through systematic assault on her sense of reality and self-worth. He made it clear that he would view the continuation of her pregnancy as ultimate proof that she didn't truly love or understand him, and that their relationship could not survive such a fundamental betrayal of their shared values and goals. The surgical procedure went wrong, leading to serious infection requiring emergency intervention. As Carol fought for her life, Steinbeck showed no remorse, seeming primarily concerned with how her crisis would affect his schedule. The infection ultimately required hysterectomy, permanently ending her ability to have children and fulfilling his wish that reproduction never interfere with his productivity. Steinbeck's response to Carol's physical and emotional trauma revealed complete absence of empathy. Rather than providing comfort during recovery, he treated her suffering as inconvenience. The couple never resumed physical intimacy, representing his complete withdrawal once Carol could no longer serve his needs while remaining sexually available. The public success of The Grapes of Wrath provided Steinbeck with convenient justification for his domestic brutality. He positioned himself as someone whose artistic mission was so important that personal considerations had to be subordinated to the greater good of his literary production. The novel's themes of social justice became a shield behind which he could hide his private cruelties. The controversy surrounding the novel also provided distraction from his domestic crimes. Conservative politicians and business leaders objected to its portrayal of capitalist exploitation. Some accused Steinbeck of communist sympathies. Libraries banned the book, and he received death threats. While these attacks were undoubtedly stressful, his response revealed his characteristic inability to distinguish between legitimate criticism and persecution. Hollywood's interest in adapting his work brought new opportunities for escape from domestic responsibilities. Film studios competed for rights to The Grapes of Wrath and of Mice and Men, requiring travel to Los Angeles and extended negotiations that kept him away from home for weeks. These business trips provided relief from guilt while exposing him to a more glamorous world that made his domestic life seem increasingly burdensome. It was during this period of professional triumph and personal dissolution that Steinbeck first encountered Gwyn Conger, the nightclub singer who would become his second wife and next victim. Their initial meeting occurred while Carol was still recovering from her hysterectomy and struggling with depression that followed her forced abortion and permanent sterilization. Gwyn represented everything Carol no longer provided: youth, beauty, sexual availability, and most importantly, ignorance of his true character. She was 18 years younger than Steinbeck and had not witnessed the gradual transformation that had turned him from charming suitor into domestic tyrant. Steinbeck's pursuit of Gwyn, while Carol was still bedridden from surgery, reveals the complete absence of loyalty or gratitude that characterized his approach to intimate relationships. Rather than honoring his commitment to Carol or acknowledging his role in her physical and psychological destruction, he simply began shopping for her replacement. The affair developed according to the same pattern that had characterized his earlier romantic conquests. He presented himself as misunderstood and underappreciated, trapped in marriage to someone who could not comprehend his artistic needs. He portrayed Carol not as the devoted partner she had been, but as a burden and obstacle to his creative fulfillment. As 1939 ended, Steinbeck had achieved everything he claimed to want: literary fame, financial security, critical acclaim, and public recognition as a voice for social justice. But these achievements were built on systematic destruction of the woman who had made them possible, a campaign of domestic terrorism that had left Carol physically mutilated, psychologically devastated, and emotionally abandoned. The Second World War provided Steinbeck perfect escape from domestic wreckage, offering socially acceptable abandonment of the woman whose life he had destroyed while positioning himself as patriotic hero. By 1941, his marriage to Carol had become a hollow shell. The forced abortion and hysterectomy had left her shattered. But rather than showing remorse, Steinbeck treated her presence as inconvenience, interfering with pursuit of other women. His wartime service as correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune represented the culmination of transforming personal escape into public service. But Steinbeck's enthusiasm for combat exceeded legitimate journalism boundaries. His participation in commando raids crossed into active combat, violating non-combatant protocols. During raids on German-held Mediterranean islands, he used a Thompson submachine gun to capture enemy positions, engaging in combat that put himself and others at unnecessary risk. This wasn't commitment to journalistic integrity, but need for violent excitement that had found socially acceptable outlet. Some biographers suggest he sustained traumatic brain injury during combat, a theory used to explain increasingly cruel post-war behavior. However, this conveniently ignores his pattern of abuse predating any possible war-related injury. A more plausible explanation is that combat exposure provided new techniques for psychological domination while reducing inhibitions. When he returned in 1944, the birth of his first son Thomas, with new wife Gwyn, should have been joyful renewal, but marked the beginning of paternal rejection, surpassing even his treatment of Carol. From Thomas's birth, Steinbeck made clear he viewed his son as unwelcome intrusion rather than blessing. He resented the time infant care required from Gwyn, household disruption, and financial costs. Most disturbing, he seemed unable to form emotional attachment, treating Thomas as a stranger barely tolerated in his home. John Steinbeck, the fourth's birth in 1946, only intensified his resentment. His behavior during Gwyn's pregnancies revealed the same cruelty that characterized his treatment of Carol, but with refinements demonstrating increased sophistication as psychological abuser. According to testimony from Gwyn herself that emerged in 2018 interviews, Steinbeck forced her to end several pregnancies through abortion, demonstrating his rejection of fatherhood was absolute. The systematic emotional abuse he inflicted while she was pregnant represented calculated cruelty designed to maximize her psychological distress. He would interrupt children's bedtime routines, demand attention for trivial matters when she was exhausted, and make clear he viewed her maternal instincts as competition for loyalty to him. What made this abuse particularly insidious was its timing and precision. Steinbeck had learned from his experiences with Carol that pregnant women were especially vulnerable to psychological manipulation, and he exploited this vulnerability with clinical efficiency. He would wait until Gwyn was at her most physically uncomfortable during the final months of pregnancy, when sleep was difficult and movement painful, to create household emergencies that demanded her immediate attention. These manufactured crises followed a predictable pattern. He would claim to need urgent help with some aspect of his writing, insisting that only she could provide the assistance required. When she pointed out that she was exhausted and needed rest, he would accuse her of not caring about his work or their financial future. When she complied with his demands despite her physical discomfort, he would find fault with her performance and use her mistakes as evidence of her inadequacy as a partner. This double-bind strategy was psychologically devastating because it made her feel responsible for problems that were entirely of his creation. No matter how she responded to his demands, she was wrong, and her wrongness justified whatever punishment he decided to impose. The pattern kept her focused on trying to anticipate and avoid his displeasure, rather than recognizing that his behavior was deliberately designed to be impossible to satisfy. The isolation he imposed on Gwyn extended beyond the physical boundaries of their home to include systematic interference with any relationship that might provide her with emotional support or alternative perspectives on her situation. He would sabotage social connections through deliberate, embarrassing behavior at gatherings, discourage visits from her friends and family members through hostile treatment, and create household crises that prevented her participation in community activities that might have provided respite from his control. The most infamous example of his twisted priorities involved his pet rat's death. When the rat died, Steinbeck wept openly, displaying more genuine emotion than Gwyn ever saw him show toward their children. He wept for his rat, not his sons. The stark contrast provided chilling illustration of his inverted empathy. He could form emotional attachments to creatures, posing no threat to his supremacy, while remaining cold toward human beings whose love challenged his narcissistic self-image. The terror he inflicted extended to active psychological torture designed to maintain absolute control. He would create household crises, forcing Gwyn to choose between children's needs and his demands. This double-bind strategy ensured she could never make the right choice, keeping her in constant anxiety and self-doubt. The psychological framework kept her focused on anticipating his displeasure, rather than recognizing his behavior was the problem. For nearly 70 years after their divorce, Gwyn Conger's account remained buried in archives, dismissed by biographers who preferred the mythology of the tortured artist. When those interviews were finally published in 2018, they revealed systematic domestic violence so brutal it challenged everything the literary world thought it knew about America's celebrated author. The woman who spoke to interviewers wasn't seeking revenge, but trying to make sense of experiences so traumatic she had spent years questioning her own memories. The clinical precision with which she describes specific abuse incidents suggests someone forced to develop documentary accuracy as a survival mechanism. Gwyn's account of physical violence began with what she described as Steinbeck's deliberate escalation from psychological abuse to outright assault during her pregnancies, when she was most vulnerable. The timing wasn't coincidental but calculated, representing his understanding that pregnancy would limit her resistance options. The most shocking incident occurred during her second pregnancy with John Steinbeck IV. According to her testimony, an argument over trivial domestic matters escalated when she refused immediate submission to his demands. Rather than accepting resistance, Steinbeck responded with violence, both spontaneous and deliberately targeted at her pregnancy. He kicked her down a flight of stairs while she was pregnant, an assault that could easily have killed both her and their unborn child. The attack wasn't momentary loss of control but calculated act designed to cause maximum harm while sending an unmistakable message about defying his will. The physical trauma was severe, but psychological impact was more devastating. Gwyn realized the man she'd married was capable of murdering their child rather than tolerating any challenge to his authority. This knowledge created terror that no amount of later apology could diminish. Steinbeck's aftermath behavior revealed the sophisticated nature of his abuse. He didn't deny his actions, but presented his violence as regrettable yet understandable response to her failure to appreciate his need. This pattern became standard in his domestic terrorism, framing assaults as educational experiences while placing responsibility for preventing future violence entirely on victims' shoulders. The kicking incident wasn't isolated but part of systematic physical intimidation. Gwynne described numerous other instances, each carefully calibrated to cause pain and fear, without creating injuries that might attract outside attention or require medical documentation. The sadistic games went beyond simple violence into psychological torture designed to break down her sense of reality and self-worth. He created elaborate scenarios where she was forced to choose between impossible alternatives, ensuring whatever decision she made would result in punishment he could present as natural consequence of poor judgment. The financial manipulation represented another dimension of systematic abuse, showing how he used economic control to limit her resistance options. Despite substantial earnings from literary success, he kept Gwynne in financial dependence that made survival without his support difficult to imagine. He alternated between generous wealth displays and petty spending restrictions, creating uncertainty that kept Gwynne focused on maintaining his approval rather than building independent resources. When she asked for household money or children's needs, he treated requests as evidence of greed and ingratitude. The impact on their children provides perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence of Steinbeck's comprehensive failure as a human being. Gwynne watched her sons learn to navigate their father's unpredictable moods with survival skills children should never need to develop, becoming experts at reading his emotional state and adjusting behavior to minimize triggering his rage. Thomas and John IV learned early that their father's attention was something to fear rather than seek, that their needs were secondary to his comfort, and that their mother's primary loyalty had to be to him rather than them. This warping of normal family dynamics created psychological wounds affecting both boys throughout their lives. The isolation Steinbeck imposed extended beyond financial control to systematic interference with relationships that might provide outside support or perspective. He would sabotage social connections through embarrassing behavior, discourage visits from friends and family, and create household crises preventing community participation. The testimony Gwynne provided decades after divorce revealed not only specific abuse details, but also long-term psychological impact of living under such systematic terror. She described symptoms we now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, difficulty forming trusting relationships, and persistent anxiety about safety. Perhaps most tragically, she revealed how Steinbeck's abuse affected her ability to trust her own perceptions and memories. The gaslighting techniques were so sophisticated that she spent years questioning whether abuse had been as severe as remembered, whether she had somehow provoked or deserved treatment received. This self-doubt wasn't accidental, but represented the intended outcome of his psychological warfare. By convincing victims they couldn't trust their own experiences or judgment, he ensured they would be unlikely to seek help or accurately describe their situation to others who might provide assistance. The courage required for Gwynne to speak honestly, even decades later, cannot be overstated. She knew her testimony would challenge established narrative about one of America's most celebrated authors, that she would be accused of lying or exaggerating, and that many would prefer believing in tortured genius mythology rather than accepting reality of his domestic crimes. Her decision to break silence wasn't motivated by revenge, but represented final attempt to reclaim her story and provide voice for other victims whose experiences had been erased or minimized by society's preference for comfortable myths over uncomfortable truths. Ed Ricketts's death in 1948 represented loss of Steinbeck's closest friendship and primary source of intellectual stimulation outside family relationships. But rather than driving him to seek deeper connection with wife and children, Ricketts's death seemed to intensify his resentment of domestic responsibilities and determination to maintain absolute control. By the end of 1948, John Steinbeck had completed his transformation from the promising young writer who had charmed Carol Henning into the domestic monster who had destroyed 2 marriages and traumatized multiple children. The stage was set for the final act of his second marriage and his pursuit of a third victim who would help him complete the construction of his public mythology while burying forever the truth about his private character. The marriage of John Steinbeck to Elaine Scott in December 1950 has been celebrated as evidence of personal redemption, but careful examination reveals something more calculated. The evolution of his abusive techniques, from crude domestic terrorism to sophisticated reputation management, by a man who had learned that public perception was as important as private control. Elaine Scott wasn't the vulnerable young woman Steinbeck had typically targeted. At 37, she was professionally accomplished, financially independent, and emotionally mature enough to recognize red flags invisible to Carol and Gwyn. This difference required Steinbeck to modify his approach entirely, developing more subtle methods of control. His courtship demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychology that made him both great writer and dangerous predator. He presented himself as misunderstood artist, whose previous relationships failed because wives couldn't appreciate his genius. The violence that destroyed his marriages was reframed as evidence of passionate temperament and creative intensity. Their wedding, 1 week after Elaine's divorce was finalized, was masterful public relations transforming sordid adultery sequence into romantic story of mature people finding love. Early marriage years appeared to validate this redemption narrative, as Steinbeck seemed finally stable and content. But this surface tranquility masked the same control patterns, refined to avoid detection. Rather than crude terrorism employed with Gwyn, he developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining dominance while preserving healthy partnership appearance. His treatment of East of Eden provides crucial insight into how personal relationships continued serving his needs. The novel, structured around Kathy Ames, whom he described as a psychic monster, was explicitly based on Gwyn, representing his attempt to rewrite their relationship history and position himself as victim rather than perpetrator. Through this fictional portrayal, he could present his marriage version to the public while destroying Gwyn's reputation. The novel served as both artistic achievement and character assassination, demonstrating his ability to weaponize literary talent against those threatening his carefully constructed image. The timing of East of Eden's publication, during peak court battles with Gwyn over custody and support, wasn't coincidental. The novel provided platform for presenting his narrative while discrediting her testimony about his abuse. By positioning her as villain in his literary masterpiece, he made it virtually impossible for her to challenge his version of events. This use of his literary reputation as weapon in personal conflicts reveals the calculated nature of his approach to relationships and public image. He understood that his status as celebrated author gave him credibility and sympathy that his victims could never match, and he exploited this advantage ruthlessly to protect himself from accountability. The Nobel Prize in Literature he received in 1962 represented ultimate validation of this strategy, establishing him permanently as one of America's greatest writers and making criticism of his personal character seem petty and irrelevant. His acceptance speech, with soaring rhetoric about celebrating human greatness and opposing despair, stands as perhaps the most cynical performance of his career. The same man who spoke eloquently about compassion and courage had spent decades systematically destroying the courage and compassion of those closest to him, using his understanding of human psychology not to heal and inspire, but to manipulate and control. The later years revealed limitations of his reformed persona and persistent underlying pathology. His support for the Vietnam War demonstrated fundamental authoritarianism and identification with power rather than justice. His harsh criticism of peace protesters as dirty-minded and shameful revealed contempt for vulnerability that had always characterized his private relationships. His final break with son John over a marijuana arrest provided clearest evidence that his capacity for cruelty had not been reformed, but merely redirected. When his son was arrested for possession, Steinbeck publicly declared he should have been jailed and that he was ashamed of his own flesh and blood for disgracing the family name. This abandonment of his child in favor of his public reputation revealed the same priorities that had governed his entire life. The estrangement lasting until Steinbeck's death represents final proof that his apparent transformation was carefully maintained performance rather than genuine change. In 1967, Steinbeck traveled to Vietnam as a correspondent for Newsday magazine. His sons were on active duty, and he was allowed to visit them, even manning a machine gun position briefly. He was fascinated by American weaponry and became a wholehearted supporter of the war effort, writing that the hippie peace protesters gave him a shiver of shame with their dirty clothes and shuffling drag-ass protests. His enthusiasm for the war revealed the same attraction to violence and authority that had characterized his domestic relationships. The man who had written compassionately about society's victims showed no compassion when those victims challenged established power structures that he now identified with completely. On his way home from Vietnam, he stopped in Hong Kong and injured his back while helping a delivery man, requiring months of painful recovery and spinal fusion surgery. His final years at his East 72nd Street home in New York were marked by declining health, further minor strokes, and the bitter knowledge that his relationships with his sons had been permanently poisoned by decades of neglect and cruelty. On December 20, 1968, John Steinbeck died of heart failure at age 66. His body had been worn down by decades of heavy drinking and smoking, but perhaps more significantly, by the psychological toll of maintaining such elaborate deceptions about his true nature for so many years. His death was mourned by readers around the world who had found inspiration in his novels, and by a literary establishment that had embraced him as one of America's most important moral voices. The obituaries celebrated his compassionate portrayals of human dignity and his commitment to giving voice to society's forgotten people. But the man who died that December evening had lived two completely separate lives: the public life of a celebrated author and moral voice, and the private life of a domestic terrorist who had systematically destroyed the lives of those who loved him. In accordance with his wishes, he was cremated, and his ashes interred at the family gravesite in Salinas, returning to the landscape that had shaped his contradictions. The careful construction of his legacy during his final years had involved systematic suppression of testimony from his victims, ensuring their version of events would not be preserved or taken seriously. Gwyn's interviews were buried in archives while his own version, presented through fiction and managed public statements, became accepted truth. This suppression represents perhaps the most successful aspect of his reputation management strategy. By controlling the narrative about his personal relationships and ensuring victims' voices were marginalized, he shaped his legacy in ways that protected both his literary reputation and his self-image as a fundamentally decent man whose struggles enhanced rather than contradicted his artistic achievements. The Secret Life of John Steinbeck forces us to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature: that extraordinary empathy and stunning cruelty can coexist within the same mind. His story is not simply the biography of a troubled writer, but a case study in how society chooses to construct and maintain myths that allow us to separate artistic achievement from personal character. The clinical evidence reveals behavior extending far beyond ordinary struggles of difficult personality. What emerges is systematic domestic terrorism spanning 4 decades, orchestrated by someone whose understanding of human psychology was sophisticated enough to create beloved literature, while employing that same knowledge to inflict maximum damage on wives and children. The psychiatric assessment doesn't support comfortable explanations offered to excuse his behavior. This wasn't mental illness, traumatic brain injury, or unfortunate consequence of artistic sensitivity. Instead, we see character disorder of the most fundamental kind: complete inability to recognize other human beings as autonomous individuals, deserving basic dignity and respect. The compartmentalization of his empathy represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychology. The same imagination that could create characters like Tom Joad and Lenny Small was utterly absent when understanding the inner lives of Carol Henning, or Gwyn Conger. This selective empathy was cultivated, a deliberate choice to reserve emotional resources for literary purposes while denying them to those needing his love most desperately. The modern reassessment cannot avoid grappling with whether art created through systematic exploitation can be celebrated without acknowledging its human cost. The migrant workers whose suffering inspired the Grapes of Wrath have been memorialized, their struggles given lasting significance. But the women and children who enabled that achievement through their own suffering have been largely erased, their voices silenced by a literary establishment preferring comfortable myths. Gwyn Conger's testimony represents more than historical correction. It provides voice for all victims whose experiences were dismissed because their abusers possessed talents society valued more highly. Her courage in speaking decades later, knowing her account would be challenged, stands as testament to truth's resilience and the importance of bearing witness to experiences others would prefer forgotten. The broader implications extend beyond literary biography into fundamental questions about how we evaluate artistic achievement and moral character. The traditional approach of separating the man from his work becomes ethically indefensible when that work was created through systematic exploitation. The novels that established Steinbeck's reputation were typed by wives whose labor was unpaid and unrecognized, supported by women whose dreams were sacrificed to his ambitions. The psychological framework that enabled Steinbeck's contradictions offers insight into how individuals and institutions can maintain ethical blindness while performing socially valued work. The same cognitive mechanisms that allowed him to champion the oppressed while oppressing his family operate at larger scales, permitting organizations and societies to celebrate justice in abstract terms while ignoring cruelty in their immediate sphere. The final accounting reveals a man whose literary genius was linked to his capacity for intimate cruelty, not because artistic achievement requires pathology, but because his particular pathology found expression through both creative and destructive channels. The empathy that made his fiction powerful was redirected away from those needing it most, toward imaginary characters who could provide success without demanding reciprocal care. The secret Steinbeck kept wasn't that he was flawed, many great artists have been, but that he was fundamentally incapable of basic human connection, making intimate relationships possible. His marriages weren't partnerships, but elaborate performances designed to extract maximum benefit while providing minimum, genuine intimacy. His children weren't beloved offspring, but inconvenient competitors for resources he believed belonged entirely to him. The revelation forces us to confront our own complicity in maintaining myths, serving our psychological needs, rather than historical accuracy. The comfortable narrative of the tortured artist, whose struggles enhanced his creative output, is more appealing than the disturbing reality of systematic domestic terrorism disguised as artistic temperament. The legacy question cannot be resolved through simple formulas that condemn or celebrate his achievements. Instead, it requires developing sophisticated frameworks for understanding how extraordinary talent and moral failure coexist, how artistic achievement can emerge from profound human damage, and how we can acknowledge both creative work's value and the cost at which it was created. The Secret Life of John Steinbeck stands as a reminder that our heroes are always more complex and often more troubling than our myths suggest. The choice isn't between celebrating or condemning him, but between continuing to participate in comfortable deceptions, protecting our illusions, or accepting the more difficult task of understanding how greatness and monstrosity can inhabit the same human heart. The tragedy of Steinbeck is not that he wrote about compassion while living without it. It's that millions found hope in words written by a man who systematically denied hope to those closest to him. That paradox, disturbing as it may be, offers the possibility of genuine understanding rather than the false comfort of maintained ignorance. The truth, however uncomfortable, demands acknowledgement, if we are to learn anything meaningful from the complex relationship between artistic genius and human character.